Welcome to the 2021 MLK Celebration, hosted by the South Carolina chapter of the American Association of Blacks in Energy. We're so glad you were able to join. We do have a treat for you today. I'm really excited and can't wait for you to hear the guest speaker today. So the South Carolina chapter has existed for 35 plus years. Today on the call, we have the Virginia chapter as well as other guests from Dominion and outside. You see here on the screen our officers. I did want to make a note, this event is being recorded. Unfortunately, I think I blew it with the sound on Dr. King's speech, but maybe I'll have to do that again. So the mission of AABE is to provide direct input into the deliberations and developments of energy policies, regulations, emerging technologies, and environmental issues. AABE was founded by Clark Watson. Please visit aabe.org for more information. So yesterday we celebrated MLK. We celebrated Dr. King's birthday. This was first observed some 35 years ago, January 20th, 1986. One of my favorite quotes from Dr. King is, "We must live together as brothers or perish together as fools." So our speaker today, and I need to look and be sure he has joined us. I'm going to go ahead and introduce him, and then I'll text him and see if he's jumping on now. Mr. James Lee Felder. He is a native of Sumter, South Carolina. He's a Clark College graduate. Clark is now Clark University in Atlanta, Georgia. He is an alum of Howard University School of Law. He served in the U.S. Army Honor Guard. He also served in the South Carolina General Assembly in the House of Representatives, 1970 to 1972. He was one of three Black representatives that served in 1970. It was the first since Reconstruction to have Black members. He is an Omega Psi Phi member, 60 plus years. He's also an author and an educator. He is also president of the Voter Education Project. And if you didn't catch it, he's also my father. I'm Adrian Felder Wright. He's a grandfather and a father. So today, I wanted him to talk with us about civil rights in South Carolina and the nation in light of all that has happened in the last weeks and months. Let me pause for just a moment and contact him. Okay. Well, right. Welcome, Mr. Felder. Me and my dad did a dress rehearsal this morning and it went pretty well. I guess I forgot to tell him he needed to use this link instead of the test link. So,
Sorry about that.
Here we are. Yeah, so here we are. So I've had the chance to introduce you right. And we've got some information on the screen, just some pictures, but I wanted to share a bit from your book entitled Civil Rights in South Carolina, From Peaceful Protests to Groundbreaking Rulings. So I quote, "The demise of Black political participation began when the incumbent governor, Republican Daniel Chamberlain, was challenged by a Democrat, Wade Hampton III. The Hampton forces used every violent means available to intimidate and discourage Blacks from voting. Stuffed ballot boxes in Edgefield County provided Hampton with a margin of victory." Excuse me. "In some counties, there was a larger number of votes cast than there were registered voters. The election was close and both sides claimed victory. For a short period of time, South Carolina had two governors. In the presidential election of 1876, a race between Democrat Samuel Tilden of New York and Republican Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio was close because of voting irregularities in the South. The election was thrown into the U.S. House of Representatives. The Southern members agreed to support Hayes if they would end Reconstruction. The Compromise of 1876 was struck. The Democrats supported Hayes in exchange for removing the federal troops from the South. By 1896, Blacks had lost all the gains acquired during Reconstruction and would be subjected to a new kind of slavery called Jim Crowism and the Black Codes. George Washington Murray of Sumter, a distant cousin of Jim Clyburn, would be the last Black to serve in the U.S. Congress in 1897. So it sounds like history repeats itself.
Exactly. And that's some of what you were seeing in the last several weeks, trying to change the results of the Electoral College. And what happened back during the period that you just talked about was a situation where neither party got a majority of the electoral votes. And so the deal was struck, and South Carolina was, of course, a part of that. And then all those irregularities at the ballot boxes did occur. And as a result, we went into a new kind of discrimination called Jim Crow laws. In 1896, in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, it was the nail in the coffin when they said that in effect that we didn't have to recognize any rights gained by Blacks during Reconstruction and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So from 1896 up until 1960, we had no Black elected officials in South Carolina. There was like a 50-year gap when nothing was going on until 1939, when the NAACP was organized in South Carolina. We then began to make some progress. So the book that you just mentioned, The Civil Rights in South Carolina, was an effort by me to capture what has happened to us since 1939, when we began to get our legs under us again. The NAACP was organized in South Carolina, and things began to happen. Lawsuits were filed. First lawsuit was to desegregate, or not desegregate, was to equalize teacher pay, 1944. That was a case with a Black female out of Charleston sued for equal pay. We won the lawsuit, and that was the beginning of 9 lawsuits in South Carolina that began to level the playing field. The equal teacher pay occurred. After that, that was followed by the building of the law school at South Carolina State College, because Blacks could not go to USC. And that was followed by the Democratic Party case of Elmo versus Rice to desegregate the Democratic Party primary because we could not participate. As a result, we had no voice in the political process. And that was followed by the case in Clarendon County, Briggs versus Elliott, which led to Brown versus the board. And then the Sarah Mae Fleming case to desegregate the buses. Most people pinpoint the Rosa Parks case as the beginning of civil rights, but it really was the case in Columbia. Sarah Mae Fleming wanted to board a bus that was operated then by South Carolina Electric and Gas, which became a part of SCANA, and of course, SCANA is now Dominion. But she desegregated the bus in a lawsuit a year and a half prior to the Rosa Parks case. Why didn't you hear about Sarah Mae Fleming? She was an 18-year-old domestic worker in Columbia. After the case was over, she just sort of faded into history. On the other hand, Rosa Parks was a secretary of the NAACP in Montgomery, Alabama, and a 40-year-old seamstress. So when her case came to the Supreme Court, the court said, case in South Carolina. Therefore, Montgomery, Alabama, you've got to desegregate your buses. So I say that to share with you that South Carolina has been first in several cases that affect us nationally, and we're kind of lost. And so this book was an effort to bring those cases to the forefront. Lots of things happened during that period. Thurgood Marshall spent almost 10 years in South Carolina, from 44 to 54, as the lead lawyer on all of those cases. Of course, his co-counsel was Harold Bulwell, local lawyer from Columbia, South Carolina, Howard University graduate. and they handled all of those cases. But the linchpin in all of those cases was the federal judge in Charleston, J. Waiters Waring was his name. Waring was a blue blood Charlestonian. However, when the first case came before him, he ruled in our favor. It only took him 15 minutes to render a decision on the case of Duval versus the School Board of Charleston County. Normally, when you go to court, the plaintiff puts its case on first, and the defendant then follows with its case. On that particular day, Judge Waring turned to the defense table, the lawyers representing the school board, and said, have you heard about the case in Virginia on equal teacher pay? They started fumbling through their briefs, and Thurgood Marshall stood up, raised his hand. He said, Mr. Marshall, I didn't ask you, sit down. They finally found it. Then he said, when did you have you all heard about the case in Montgomery County, Maryland on equal teacher pay? Again, they scrambled, looking for it. Again, Thurgood Marshall stood and the judge stared him down. Then Judge Waring turned to Thurgood Marshall and he said, Mr. Marshall, I was not being rude to you because you see, I knew you knew about both of those cases. I wanted to know, when did the school board in Charleston County know that they had to pay black and white teachers the same salary? He said, this is a simple case. Mr. Marshall, when do you want them to start paying equal pay? Well, Thurgood Marshall stood there with his mouth wide open, not knowing what to say. He said, finally, he said, Judge, you ought to give me a few days to prepare an order. Judge said, you got 5 days to prepare an order. Banged his gavel, end of story. 15 minutes, and we had won our first civil rights case in South Carolina. Then, of course, the next case was the South Carolina Law School. Jonathan Wrighton, World War II veteran, came home, wanted to go to law school. The only law school in South Carolina was USC. They wouldn't let him in. So Judge Waring heard the case, and when both sides had presented their cases, he said, all right, you have 3 options. He said to the lawyers representing the University of South Carolina, you either let him in the University of South Carolina. If you don't do that, you bill him a law school at South Carolina State College. If you don't do 1 or 2, I'm going to close the law school at the University of South Carolina. Now, what were these people going to do? All of a sudden, this was like July 1947. September 1947, 2 months later, law school was up and running at South Carolina State College. It wasn't much of a law school. It was housed in the main library in a corner. Thurgood Marshall called it $1.50 law school, but it was a law school. Later, 2 years later, they finally built a structure, a building for the law school. And that little law school at South Carolina State College graduated some of the greatest lawyers in the history of the state. It included Federal Judge Matthew Perry, it included Chief Justice Ernest Finney of the South Carolina Supreme Court, Jasper Curitan, and many others at the circuit court level and the family court level, all because of Judge Waring. The other case was the case on voting. We could not vote in the all-white Democratic Party primary. We had no other options. So blacks during those days, you could only vote in the Republican primary, and there wasn't much Republican primary because there weren't any whites in the Republican primary during that day. So Judge Waring again ruled that the Democratic Party had to open up to let blacks participate. And then the big enchilada was the case in Clarendon County, Briggs versus Elliott. Some dirt farmers in Clarendon County decided they wanted a bus to transport the kids to school. Didn't have one. Some had to walk 9 miles one way to get to school. So they filed a complaint. Again, Thurgood Marshall comes in, rallied the team, told them what they needed to do, and Briggs versus Elliott was on its way to the Supreme Court. Briggs' case got to the court before the other cases. And you heard of Brown versus the board out of Kansas. There was a case out of Virginia, the Edwards case. There was a case out of Delaware, the Gephardt case. And what they did was to put all 5 cases together and under the heading Brown versus the Board of Education. The misinformation out there is that Thurgood Marshall argued Brown versus the board. No, he did not. He argued the Briggs case all the way from the three panel judge court up to the Supreme Court. The Brown case was argued by Robert Carter. The Brown case was about the elementary schools. The high schools were already integrated in Kansas, but it was the elementary schools that were not. So that's how Brown came into the picture. Now there's a problem that Chief Justice Earl Warren has. He wants a unanimous decision. He's afraid if he put the Briggs case on top, that he would not get all of the justices to support it. So instead of putting Briggs on top, he put Brown on top, and then Briggs, and then the other 3 cases. And he was able to get a unanimous decision from the Supreme Court. But again, South Carolina leading the pack in terms of changing laws that affect us nationally. Those were the cases during that period, during that 10-year span. And it changed not just South Carolina, but it changed this country. Later on, we would enter into political arena because we were now able to register Blacks to vote. That was my first job when I came home to South Carolina in 1967 to run what was called the Voter Education Project, a project that registered over 200,000 Blacks in an 18-month period. At that time, we only had 8 Black elected officials in the entire state of South Carolina. 4 were down in Eastover, and the other 4 were down in Beaufort County. Today, there's 928 Black elected officials. Today, we have over 1 million Black registered voters, and we have Blacks in the South Carolina, in the U.S. Senate, Jim Clyburn in the House, and we're all over the place now, I guess you would say. But because of the NAACP organized in 1939, clearing the path for us to make these accomplishments, we're forever indebted to that organization. Now, in the book also, you will find things happening in other communities. So there are chapters devoted to Charleston and Sumter and Florence and other cities that had their own internal movement to right the wrongs of the time. I don't know how much time I've got, Adrian, to take questions, but I'm willing to do that. Say again.
That's probably this is probably a good time to ask if there are some questions. So I did share some of your history, pallbearer for John F. Kennedy, as far as serving in the Honor Guard, serving in the General Assembly in South Carolina, along with Herbert Fielding and I.S. Levy Johnson. Just a snippet of what you've been involved in. Is there someone that had a question or wanted to bring something up?
Is Jim Stuckey on the call?
You've been called out, Jim.
Let me share this. Maybe he may be muted, but let me just talk about his, okay. Let me talk about a lawyer in Charleston. Richard Fields is one of probably the last of the old line Black lawyers in the state. He's certainly the oldest one. Richard Fields is 100 years old, Jim Stuckey, and he is still practicing law. Do I need to repeat that? 100 years old, still practicing law in Charleston. He closed his office 10 years ago when he was 90 years old. People kept calling him, so he built an office in his backyard in Charleston. It's a replica of his downtown office on Spring Street, and he still practiced law at 100 years old. I thought you would appreciate that. Go ahead.
Let me see if we can get Jim sound. Jim, can you try again? Yeah, the sound quality is not really good, Jim. I'm not sure what's going on.
Well, I thought Jim would appreciate that, but
Okay, absolutely. Is there anyone else that may have a question about something we've discussed? Would you
the
talk a little bit
go ahead,
about,
Lynn.
okay, Jim's going to dial in by phone.
Okay.
We'll give him a minute to do that. But in the interim, would you talk a little bit about the Honor Guard and how you were selected? Or as you
Yes,
like to say, you were just in the right place at the right time?
right place at the right time. Um, I did not want to go in the Army. I wanted to go into the Air Force. And as long as I was in college, you got deferred. But the moment I finished Clark College in Atlanta in 1961, the draft board started hunting me. And they finally caught up to me, and I was drafted into the Army. Spent 6 months here at Fort Jackson in Columbia, basic training, advanced training, leadership school, and then they shipped me off to Washington, D.C. to try out for the Army Honor Guard. The Honor Guard is that elite spit and polish unit in Washington that guards the tomb of the unknown soldier at Arlington, does White House duty. If you see a rare view of the White House and you see a military person there, it's part of the Honor Guard unit. And we bury the dead in Arlington Cemetery. I was selected to head to serve on the casket burial unit. That's the unit that handled all of the burials in Arlington Cemetery. When Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, November 22nd, I had been at Arlington for 18 months. I had done over 1,800 funerals in Arlington Cemetery. And you say, how do you do 1,800 funerals in 18 months? Well, there are some days when you would do 10 funerals. A family is only allotted 30 minutes for a funeral at Arlington Cemetery. Unless it's an officer, then you'll get an hour for the service. So on any given day, we start the day off at 9 o'clock, first funeral, 9, 9:30, 10, 10:30, 11, 11:30. Break for lunch, come back, 1, 1, 1:30, 2, 2:30. Last funeral is always at 3 o'clock in Arlington. No weekend funerals, no holiday funerals. So you would do 10 funerals in one day. Some guys couldn't handle that. They'd ask to be transferred out because you're standing there holding the flag, you're looking at the family, they're crying, and sometimes you want to cry with them. But that's what I did. Then when Kennedy was assassinated, I was a short timer in the Army. I only had 47 days left, but I was the senior NCO for funerals. And so when Kennedy died, I was on leave, getting ready to go back into society. Well, anyway, they called me back because I was the senior NCO for funerals. And so that's how I end up heading the casket team for President John F. Kennedy.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
did not, for years, people would ask me, how did you get selected? A little black boy from Sumter, South Carolina. And so that's why I wrote the book, I Buried John F. Kennedy, to bring all of those details to light.
All right. I think we've got Jim on. He sent a chat. He's on by phone. Jim?
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody, and good afternoon, Mr. Felder. Listening to you, I just have a range of emotions. I grew up in Bishopville, South Carolina, so
okay.
South Carolina was the big city for me growing up, and so I was educated K through 12 in the Lee County schools, and I can't thank you and your peers enough for all that you did for my generation of African Americans in South Carolina. And so I in terms of a couple of other things I wanted to share. One, I noticed in your bio that you are a graduate of Clark College, and there is a retired federal district judge in Richmond, Judge James Spencer, that I clerked for, who was also a graduate of Clark College. And as much as I hate to concede this point, since I pledged Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, Our general counsel, Carlos Brown, is a proud member of Omega Psi Phi, and he would not want me to let the moment pass without mentioning that to you. So I just can't thank you enough for your participation in on this event today. It's fascinating, and I wish we had a semester-long course so you could guide us through all of your experiences.
Well, you mentioned Judge James, his last name, Spencer, James Spencer. He's from Florence.
That's right.
He's from Florence, South Carolina. Went to, a matter of fact, I'm doing a book as we speak now on the lawyers of Clark College, and he's one that's featured in that book. Clark, during a period of time, there were some great lawyers to come out of Clark, and he's on that list. And that book will be out, I guess, in the within the next year. But he's quite a fellow. He has an interesting history of life himself. Yeah.
I look forward to seeing the book, and his son was just named the dean of a law school. I believe it's William and Mary Law School.
Wonderful, great. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Jim.
Sure.
So we were talking about South Carolina, and Dad, you love to say that the most, I won't say the most important things, but in history, there's always somebody from Sumter, South Carolina involved. We often laugh that everybody of significance has some tie to Sumter, South Carolina. Didn't know if you wanted to speak to that.
Yes, I do want to speak to that. Yes. Sumter was the epic center of the civil rights struggle in South Carolina. One of the founders of the state NAACP was from Sumter. Mr. McDonald, whose son was a physician, was my family doctor. And there were many leaders that came out of Sumter. Columbia couldn't hold a candlelight to the Sumter crowd. Now, who else came out of Sumter? Jim Carbon came out of Sumter. McKinley Washington came out of Sumter. The three of us grew up together in Sumter, went our separate ways, and made our mark in other cities. But we all drank the water in Sumter. And as a result of that, we always tease the other fellows in other cities that Sumter was the light of South Carolina. I could go all day talking about those persons in Sumter who made a great difference in South Carolina in terms of their contributions and so forth. Jim Clyburn and I started our journey with the youth NAACP. In 1954, he was elected president of the Youth Council in Sumter. I was elected vice president of the Youth Council in Sumter. We both went on to college. He married a librarian. I married a librarian. We both are Omegas. We both, we've done a lot of things together through the years. So Sumter, yes, we think we're the best, and we are the best.
All right. I've got a hand raised and a question. I'm going to pose this question. The question is that given our history and what our country is currently facing, what should be our posture as African Americans to avoid continuing this repetition?
We need to do more at the ballot box. You see what happened in Georgia when they went to the streets, when they went to local groups and organizations, they turned out the votes. And what happened? We were able to win a seat in Georgia. We could have won a seat in South Carolina, but we made some mistakes. We relied too much on advertising, so Jamie Harrison didn't make it. Raised a lot of money, over $100 million, but was advised to spend it in advertising. You can't win in our community on advertising. You've got to put shoe leather to the ground. You've got to knock on the doors. You've got to go where the boys are and where the girls are. You got to go to the barber shops. You got to go to the beauty shops where people are. But our survival will depend on us engaging more in the political process. So I am very pleased at what I see in Georgia, and I'm seeing other places. That's going to be our salvation. We got to be at the table. Joe Biden is there because Jim Clyburn endorsed him.
Yep.
He was
But that
about
would also
he was heading south fast until Jim came along and said, all right, here is my man. We're going to go with Joe Biden. And that turned it around for him completely. So we have to do more. The ballot is our way out of where we are now.
amen to that. You'd also agree that that doesn't just apply to national elections. We need to vote locally.
Oh, no. You got to vote locally. And we're doing real good locally. I mean, here in South Carolina, we've got, 928 Black elected officials, mayors and city council and county council, school board. We're doing great locally in South Carolina. Some other places are not, but we've got to build on more statewide elections. And we've got, next year, we go into statewide elections. Governor, lieutenant governor, all of them are up for election in South Carolina. So we got to keep this momentum going.
All right, that's good food. Terrence Cheatham, I want to call on him. He's got his hand raised. Terrence?
Is it muted?
We're not getting any sound from you, Terrence. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Well, first of all, Mr. Felder, I want to thank you for your time and sharing your knowledge and your experiences with us on the day. You gave a good input there, being from Edgefield, South Carolina.
Hello, Strong Thurman country.
Taking me back about Strong Thurman country.
Strong Thurman,
exactly right.
Yeah.
Yes, you're exactly right. So I am very closely impacted by our history on what has occurred nationally and on the state level on the political scene. But my question to you is, as you move about and continue to share this level of knowledge, could you give me a couple of points on what you would share with our youth? Because as I sit back and I talk to my children about what they're seeing on the political scene, and it's a very exciting time that they're grasping right now. And I want to make sure that as we continue to communicate with the youth, that we share accurate information as you did with us today.
All right. I tell youth, and I speak to a lot of youth groups, to get engaged early. Run for office in whatever your little group is. Get engaged early so that when you reach an age where you can register and vote, you've got that underpinning there. Again, I go back to the youth NAACP, and that's where we really need to focus on the youth council. That was my defining moment. Jim Clyburn, Jesse Jackson, we all came up through the youth council of the NAACP. It afforded us an opportunity to go to meetings, to stand up on the floor, ask questions, learn parliamentary procedure. But you've got to get involved and you've got to start early. So that's what I recommend. And whenever I get an invitation, whether it's just 5 or 6 youth meetings someplace, I'm happy to meet with them, share with them my experience, and challenge them to move forward. Now, let's go back to Strom Thurmond for a minute in Edgefield County. Strom Thurmond, he was a chameleon, I guess you would say. He sort of floated with the tide, whichever it was going. When I came home to do the voter registration thing, after we got 100,000 blacks registered to vote, Strom used to say he couldn't say Negro. He was in the Negroes. We got 100,000 black registered voters. Old Strom Thurmond, all of a sudden, he learned how to say Negro. We got 150,000 registered. Strom Thurmond was sending out letters. My dear black constituents, can I be of service to you? We got 200,000 of us registered to vote, and Strom Thurmond was the first of the Southern congressperson to hire a black person on his staff. And that was Tom Moss out of Orangeburg. Tom worked for Strom for 30 years. So you see, the vote matters. It matters if you utilize and take advantage of it. But I just had to throw that in about your homeboy and Strom Thurmond. The other thing was, Strom was not a deadbeat dad. You know, he had a black daughter who went to South Carolina State. He paid her tuition. He visited her regularly. And the monument on the State House ground now has her name on it along with his other children. The Strom Thurmond saga.
All right. That's certainly something everybody who's here in South Carolina, if you haven't been down to the State House to see that, you certainly need to go and visit. Was there anyone else? I haven't gotten any more questions or hand raised.
I thought I saw a hand raised on somewhere over there.
Yeah, that was Terrence.
Okay.
Absolutely. How do you think going forward after this, I'll say, mess of an election, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, what's the road look like for them?
The road is going to be tough because they've got so many challenges out there at the same time. In addition to 45 opening the door for all the crazies to come out and all the racists and all of that, they've got to deal with that. They've got to deal with this pandemic we're going through. They got to deal with a tough economy. So it's not going to be easy, but I think both of them are up to the task. Both of them have the experience. They know Washington. They're empathetic. So, and they're going to put people in the right places and going to listen to them as opposed to 45. He just put cronies in high places and we got what we got. So it's been a tough 4 years, but we'll survive it. What concerns me now is that you now have these homegrown terrorists out there. Sometimes we forget that we've had them for a long time. They forget Timothy McVeigh, who bombed the federal courthouse in Oklahoma. He was a Nazi, racist, even though he was a military guy. So I'm a little worried now about radicalization that's going on among some of these white groups. And certainly 45 didn't help it at all. It's like he just opened the windows. And what did you have? You had what you saw on Wednesday, the 6th of January, people storming the Capitol. And the world's looking at us and now, wait a minute, you come and you preach democracy to us, and now you can't handle it right at home. So it's going to be a tough road for Joe and Kamala, but I think they can handle it. He's surrounding himself with good people. But we're going to have to be on watch and on guard for those Nazi-like individuals out there.
So what do you think issues for South Carolina in the next 4 years that we will look to this administration to address? I know in South Carolina, our governor has refused money in the past with Obamacare and some other issues. What are some issues that you think might come to light or we need to be aware of?
That is, you just put your finger on healthcare. We have 6 counties now with no hospitals. And we have been arguing for expanding Medicaid and Medicare for the last 6 years. When Nikki Haley was governor, Jesse Jackson and I visited her. We spent an hour trying to convince her to let the Medicaid expansion money come into South Carolina. It was $14 billion earmarked for South Carolina. She promised she would, but she didn't. Next thing I knew, she was resigning, going to be ambassador, and Medicaid expansion didn't happen. As a result, more hospitals closed. Now, this pandemic has certainly awakened us to the fact that we've got to do something on healthcare, and that's the #1 issue for me as I see it in South Carolina. And I think this pandemic has awakened so many others who in the past didn't worry about what's happening to the little counties or counties in rural areas, predominantly Black areas. Now they're seeing what a problem there can be when you have a health hazard come upon us. So that's number one, is healthcare. Number two is protecting what we've earned from a voting standpoint. We got to deal with voter suppression. It's there, it's real. And thirdly, we've got to do more at the educational level, not just at the higher education level, but the tech schools. We got to do more with them, expand them so we can provide workforces for these companies that are coming into South Carolina. I mean, we have Boeing. You know, one time we was the state agriculture, cotton, tobacco. Now we manufacture airplanes, we manufacture BMWs, we manufacture Volvos here. And those companies are coming, but if we don't have the workforce to provide the labor that they need, they were going to look elsewhere. So we're doing okay right now, but we got to continue to expand. Everybody's not going to college. But if we make technical skills available, more health skills available, we'll be okay.
Okay, yeah, definitely. I agree with all of those. Anything else anyone else may want to bring up or address or have a question? So I want to shift it back and pivot back to Dr. King.
Okay.
You are a child of that era and were around for the marches. Share your sentiments, your feelings, something that really stuck out for you that, you know, people on this call would not have been privy to.
I met Dr. King March 1960. We were planning our first sit-ins in Atlanta. I had gotten elected to second vice grand marshals at the national level for Omega. I was in DC on February 1st, 1960, when the 4 students at A&T State University staged the first sit-ins at Woolworth. Well, in that meeting, there were several college presidents. The public relations man at A&T was Ellis Corbett. He was also the editor of the Omega Oracle, which is our magazine. He got a phone call. He left the meeting. He came back in. He was white as snow, you might say. His president at A&T called and told him to bring his butt back home. He had all these press there. Students were sitting in at Woolworth. Well, the meeting broke up because we had 5 or 6 college presidents on the board, and everybody went back to where they came from. I went back to Atlanta, and Julian Vaughn and Lonnie King were waiting for me. We sat, they were at Morehouse, Julian was, and so was Lonnie. We met at Yates and Milton Drugstore, which was the student hangout, and started planning our sit-ins in Atlanta. Finally, somebody said, you know, Dr. King just moved back to Atlanta. Why don't we ask him to go with us on our first march? So we picked a committee to go meet with Dr. King. I was on the committee. He just moved back to Atlanta. We met with him the entire afternoon. He agreed to march with us. On March 15th, we had our first march downtown Atlanta. Some 4,000 students from the Atlanta University Center marched to Atlanta, two lines. I led the line that went to the state capitol. When they saw us coming, they locked it down and we marched around and went back to campus. Dr. King's group went to Rich's department store. They got arrested. But that was my first meeting with Dr. King. I would see him in later years when he came to South Carolina in 1966. To Doc Tomlinson High School over in Kingstree, South Carolina. And other times I would see him was at Penn Center, down at Frogmore, St. Helena Island. Penn Center was his retreat where he'd come to strategize and relax. I served on the board at Penn Center for 10 years. Adrian was a little girl at that time, y'all. She was like 2, 3 years old, and didn't want to go down there and be locked up in a hotel room for those lengthy meetings we would have. But those were meetings with Dr. King, and that's how I got to know him and marched with him as well.
Those are good stories. Thank you for sharing that. I guess I want to ask, what made you, first of all, choose law, and then ultimately, whether it was intended or not, become involved in civil rights, a leader of sorts for South Carolina?
It all started in Atlanta. I was a biology major at Clark, minored in chemistry and math. I was headed to med school as fast as I could, and I was going to go back home to Sumter, hang out my shingle, and practice medicine and get involved in civil rights. I knew that doctors weren't, well, they weren't pounced upon by the powers that be. You know, doctors are independent. Got to Clark, got caught up in the sit-ins, went to jail 5 or 6 times. My professor and advisor, Dr. Spriggs, the chemistry teacher, called me in one day and said, Mr. Felder, I understand what you're doing out there with all the marching and so forth, but you missed too many of my labs. I can't recommend you to med school. I said, well, Dr. Spriggs, I've changed my mind anyway. Since the sit-ins began, I've gotten involved. I plan to go to med school. I plan to go to law school. And that's what happened.
Okay.
If you are going to be a leader, you got to be out there with the people. And being president of the Student Government Association, I had no choice but to be on the picket line. And I learned so much from that, sitting in the courtroom, watching Donald Hollowell, who was the Donald Hollowell to Georgia, what Matthew Perry was to South Carolina. And that's how I end up going to law school. And once you're in law school, you get involved in politics. I joined the Washington, D.C. Young Democrats back in 1966. I worked for Congressman John Conyers in Washington from 66 through 68. So that's what got me into politics and civil rights. Yeah.
All right. Well, before we close, we do have one other question. Rhonda O'Banion, are you still on? You can unmute.
I am. Can you hear me, Adrian?
And I can hear you too.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks so much for taking the time to share all of this wealth of knowledge with us this afternoon. Absolutely love hearing all of your stories. I am from the booming metropolis of Walterboro, South Carolina.
Okay.
One question for you. What would you say, considering we're all here, the majority of us here are employees of Dominion Energy, what would you say is the appropriate role of large companies like a Dominion Energy, whose operations, whose decision-making in so many different spaces affect so many people, including people of color, when it comes to matters of social justice, environmental justice, racial equity? What can a Dominion Energy do?
Dominion can do a lot in the communities that it serves. From a diversity standpoint and inclusion as well. Dominion needs to be pushed sometimes to do the right thing, just like other corporations, not just singling out Dominion, but sometimes they don't feel what is happening outside in the community. And that's where you need organizations like the Urban League and NAACP to nudge them to do the right thing. Now, in order for that to happen, we need intelligence. And the intelligence, the only way we can get that is from people who are on the inside. So employees need, if they see a problem, you can't deal with it from within, but that problem needs to be brought to the attention of those who can knock the door down, fuss and cuss and march and do whatever has to be done to be sure that a Dominion does the right thing. As John Lewis would call, good trouble, make them do the right thing. So as an employee of Dominion, or as a ratepayer, we need to focus on them if they're not doing the right thing. I spent 2 years with Jesse Jackson, 80 through 82, and we knocked down a lot of dopers. We began with Coca-Cola. We threatened a boycott of Coca-Cola if they didn't put blacks on the board, if they didn't give up franchises to black communities. And they did. We did the same thing with the beer industry, Anheuser-Busch. Somebody has to nudge them. Somebody has to be the catalyst, or some entity has to be the catalyst to do that. But we need help from the inside in order, if we're going to do our job on the outside from a civil rights standpoint, from an economic rights standpoint. Does that answer your question?
That's
Yes,
good.
sir, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Ashley has her hand up. Ashley Barnhill.
Yes. Hello, Mr. Felder.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm fine. Where are you from, Ashley?
So I'm originally from Greenville, South Carolina, but I'm working in Columbia. And my question for you is, what do you think as individuals that white people can do in tangible actions to best support our brothers and sisters of color as we move through this social justice era?
All right. Start a conversation we don't like to have about race. We just don't like to talk about it. Whites to blacks, and even whites don't like to talk about it among themselves. But we're at a point now with this country becoming, it's really becoming diverse, more so than ever before. We have to talk about it. And if we can talk about it and get it behind us, then we can move on to things that need to be done. But it's a conversation we just don't like to have. Now, oftentimes you find there are many people who just don't know the struggle of minorities in this country. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book also. So they will have a reference point of where we've come, what we've done, what we've gone through. But that's one thing that whites can do. Engage in conversation. It can be rough, yes. And some of us just don't like to hurt other people's feelings. We feel that if we talk about it and we ask hard questions, we'll get offended and we'll close up. But it has to be done. If we're going to continue to live on this planet, and I don't see us going anyplace else at this point, we have to engage and talk about race, get it behind us so that we can move on. Now, having said that, I have two grandboys who happen to be Adrian's children. I see the future in them. They don't look at race. They have white friends, they have black friends, they sleep over at each other's houses. It's a good thing. And I'm thinking that this is going to be the generation that will really liberate us from all the racism that we experience.
Absolutely.
Thank you
Very
so
well
much, and
said.
thank you for your time.
Yes, indeed.
Well, we're about 3 minutes over. Any other burning questions or desires to answer or ask questions? I did put in the chat. You can visit jameslfelder.com. His contact information is there, email and phone, if you want to follow up with something. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for allowing me to present my dad to you. He is a treasure for us, and I'm grateful that you guys took the time to join us today. So, Dad, I think we're going to close it.
Well, it's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
Okay. All
Invite me
right.
back again.
Absolutely. I mean, we'll find another opportunity. Thanks so
Okay.
much. All right.
All
Enjoy your
right.
day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right.